So let's move on to today's clinical topic. And our speaker today is Dr. Michael Scherer. Michael Scherer is a board-certified prosthodontist practicing in Sonora, California. He earned his DMD at Nova Southeastern and did his pros training at Ohio State. He's a clinical faculty member at UNLV and Loma Linda, and he's the chief clinical officer of Zest Dental Solutions. He is an avid technology and computer hobbyist, and his involvement in digital implant dentistry has led him to develop and pioneer new approaches with 3D printing, CAD/CAM surgical systems, CBCT implant planning, and a lot of outside of the box radiographic imaging and digital design concepts. He is really an outstanding young prosthodontist and teacher, and his topic today is a new option for full arch fixed implant restorations. And I know that you will enjoy Dr. Scherer's unique and extremely well-informed take on this topic. So take it away, Michael. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Park. Let me go ahead and share my screen and make sure everybody can see my slides. Does everybody see my slides and hear me okay?
Yes.
We do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction here as well. It's really an honor and privilege to be able to be here in front of everybody today in front of the webinar program. And just a very kind shout out to everybody in the GlideWell organization for being able to host me. Dr. Park, I don't know, that was such a kind introduction. I'm tired though from here. It was so nice for you to invite me to this webinar. And I sincerely hope that this program is rewarding for everybody tuning in. As we get kicked off, a big passion piece of mine, as you've heard so far, is digital technology, and then also utilizing innovative concepts. And we heard earlier in the presentation that we have to really be focused and dialed in on being able to offer treatment solutions for our patients that are reasonably priced. And I know a big part of it too is as Dr. Park mentioned, I do practice and have the honor of practicing here in California, and then also I have a secondary location in Las Vegas. So between the two, I interact with a lot of patients that do tell me that it's just really expensive for healthcare and for dentistry. And I've made a point in my practice of looking at my patients that I tailor treatment for that is reasonably affordable. And I always use the term reasonably affordable because, sometimes when you say, well, a denture is going to be $500, people are like, oh my God, that's an insane amount of money versus, oh my God, $2,000 is an insane amount of money. So we definitely have to think about the relative nature of affordability. And my practice in Northern California has been a rural practice for these past 10 years. Per capita income is really, pretty even, or maybe definitely not the highest, definitely not the lowest, but it's definitely not, the San Francisco Bay Area or, New York City or Chicago, et cetera. And I've really enjoyed practicing in a semi-rural area. And then certainly in Las Vegas, we have a lot of retiree populations and things of that nature. And, as we start to look at the baby boom population shift, I know a big focus of mine has been able to offer affordability. So we'll go ahead and cover that here today. And then also just a shout out, my website is down here listed below. If any questions come up, some of my articles and things that I've published over the years, as well as YouTube videos, are available on the website. And then just a quick shout out as well for our kind friends down at Zest Dental Solutions. I know there's a wonderful collaboration between GlideWell and Zest for being able to work together on education. I'm so thrilled to be here to contribute to that. And then certainly I encourage you to check out some of the in-person education courses in Las Vegas, as well as some of the other educational items that's available through Zest. The topic today, as I mentioned today a little bit earlier, is really dialing in and determining, especially for full arch dentistry, what is good, what is better, and what is best. And it's a relative term, everybody, because there's so many people out there. Just ask yourself, do I like doing dentures? Some of you may say, oh, I don't know if I really like it. I like implants, sure, but the dentures, I could skip that part. Other people may say, gosh, I love doing veneers, or I love treating children. What I love about dentistry, and it's been such a privilege to be in dentistry over these past number of years, dentistry really affords the ability to find and for allowing us as dentists to tailor what our practices should be. what our passions are. So I know a big passion of mine has been treating patients that are edentulous or soon to be edentulous, either with lower cost prosthetics such as a denture or two implant overdenture to a mid-tier prosthetics, which is going to be something like a four implant overdenture, potentially a bar, and then on the higher end, a traditional fixed prosthesis. And also over these years, I'm very surgically active in my practice as well. I've learned that, in my first few years after dental school, I was always trained in dental school that the good option was the two implant overdenture. Hey, it's really great. Patients are happy. That's what the literature shows, the standard of care, et cetera. And I've also learned over the years that, my two implant overdenture patients are happy. They come in at the recall and they say, gosh, doctor, I should have done this. Oh my gosh, years ago, I'm feeling so good, but it still pinches a little bit and it's a little bit loose. Can you tighten it and adjust the sore spot? Okay, no problem. Come on in. And then I've also learned over those years when I've done 4 implants or maybe 3 or more implants per arch, those same patients come in and they look at me and I say, hey, how you doing? Their eyes light up. They go, oh my God, I should have done this 15 years ago. And you have any sore spots? No sore spots. And I'm seeing my patients less often, which arguably could be a good and a bad thing, right? But in a denture practice, sometimes it's not a bad thing because that, no news is good news. But on a sincere note, it's a bit anecdotal because I know that the evidence-based statement may say the two implant overdenture is sufficient for most cases. But what I can tell you is that, when we start thinking about what happens in a clinical practice, I know that I really, really want to go ahead and start looking at those patients because I've learned over the years that the 4 implant overdenture really is pretty ideal, especially from recall. And then essentially, I've evolved a little bit in my implant practice. And some people would look at this picture and be like, wow, this is ridiculous. I mean, how many implants per arch can you fit in there, doc? And I've really kind of learned also over these years too that, you know, good, better, and best is a relative term. I've learned that, yes, 4 implants per arch is more than sufficient. Literature supports that. But also, I've learned over the years too that the maxillary arch has a higher chance of complications, implant failure, and also long-term prosthetic complications. If I could build a couple of extra implants in there as backups down the road, if I ever lose an implant, and that's really, in my opinion, treating the patients ideal. And we don't have crystal balls, but what I do is I look at my patient straight in the face and tell them that's it. Crystal ball. But what I do know is that implants in the upper have a little bit more challenge just because the bone is softer. So I put a couple of extra implants in. Wow, doctor, really? How much is it going to charge me? No additional. I set a bulk fee. Here is my bulk fee. This is what it is for 4 implants or 6 implants. It's just I'm treating you, the person, not just your chart. And the patient's eyes light up and they're like, oh my gosh, doctor, really? You think of that? And I say, well, yeah, I'm paying myself less by putting in 2 more implants, but I want to treat you the best way possible. In my opinion, 4 is more than good on enough on the lower, and on the upper, 5 or 6 may be better. In other patients, if I don't have the bone anatomy to do that, then I stop at 4. And I'm not saying 6 is always better than 4. What I am saying is there's 2 things I've learned over these past 15 plus or minus years in practice. Number one, more implants per arch for removable restorations or fixed restorations whenever possible. Not always, not always. I'd rather have 4 well-spaced implants than 5 or 6 squeezed together. And when possible, if I have good distribution, I have good spacing, good bone, 5 or 6 implants is incredible. Okay, I have a backup implant. I've got a little bit more stability, especially my removable prosthesis, and fixed prosthetics, I've got a backup implant. And then the second thing I've learned over these years in an implant practice is I really think, this is a bit anecdotal as well, I really think that the term cantilever is something I strive to eliminate. I'm not saying cantilevers are bad, meaning if you've got a bridge and the teeth are hanging off the back, just hanging off the back, you can only put implants in the front, get all the teeth in the back. As a general rule, I try to avoid cantilevers whenever possible. So like shown here on the bottom picture, I've got a 4 implant overdenture and essentially 0 cantilever. Or if a fixed restoration, I can eliminate the cantilever. So a topic that we'll touch on a little bit later here as we go, because when we start thinking about our full arch restorations, we know that the historical main 3 removable options are what we see here. Standard complete denture, the edentulous patient needing a plain old denture, and then you have the two-implant overdenture, aka the locator overdenture, is a wonderful prosthesis. It's definitely an upgrade compared to the edentulous standard complete denture. And whenever possible, I always try to steer my patients, especially on the lower or mandibular arch, towards one of these restorations. However, the two-implant overdenture is still a tissue-supported prosthesis, and it ideally should be the same size of a plain old denture. So it's not like I can really trim or cut that denture back. Versus something like an implant-supported overdenture is a bar restoration. I can typically make it very minimal tissue contact, and I can also bulk up the soft tissue if the patient wants a fuller lip, etc. And so our three main removable options really arguably haven't changed much over these years. I still do quite a few of these. Bar restorations are fabulous on the maxilla. And you can also say, hey, well, why are you placing extra implants? Just do a bar on the maxilla or the upper. Totally, whenever possible. If I place a bar on the upper, I feel better about it. But not every patient can either have the space required because you need a lot more prosthetic bulk of the prosthesis to fit a bar. And then number two, it increases cost to the patient. And if we're going to go ahead and try to keep our affordability as reasonable as possible, I got to pass the costs on, the laboratory cost and the time of making a bar restoration. So something to think about. So when I start to approach fixed, I know that a lot of times people know me as, hey, you're the overdenture guy. I do a lot of fixed restorations in my practice, everybody. Now, not as many as overdentures, because as I mentioned, my population definitely doesn't have as many patients that have the resources to be able to do the FP1 style prosthesis, like what you see here in the bottom picture, the PFM, PFZ restoration. Those can be very expensive, both from the clinical point of view as well as from the technical and the laboratory point of view. Versus the all-on-X restoration, or the FP3 restoration, like shown at the top, is a wonderful treatment. But additional surgery, little extra steps, and it's a hybrid restoration. So a lot of times it's going to be like an all zirconia, such as like a Bruxer restoration, or it may be a combination of metal or titanium with zirconia or a type of resin in a classic sense. So this has always historically been my 3 to 5 options I've been able to offer patients. And, if I rank them, obviously the denture is the cheapest, all the way to screw routine is the highest. And about a couple of years ago or so, I was introduced to this concept called locator fixed. Over these years, I've done a lot of overdentures and locator cases, and Zest came out with this thing where I could convert an overdenture into a full arch fixed, or I can use the same locator button and do fixed. So that was kind of cool. That's now become a key aspect of my restorative practice. So all of these 6 options I offer on an everyday basis. So if we start thinking about like a full arch practice and complete denture, full arch, soon to be a dentulous patient, the classic model of full arch dentistry has been, hey, complete denture. If we're going to add implants, you've got 3 main options: 2-implant overdenture, 4-implant overdenture, or something fixed, either an FP3, like a hybrid restoration, or an FP1, like a crown and bridge style restoration. These have been classically and arguably still common today. There's nothing wrong with any of these 3 options. But as we start to think about it, if we're presented in our clinical practice, depending upon the type of patients that come to your clinical practice, you could have a lot more dentures. You could have a lot more failing dentition. Like case in point, in my practice, I see a lot more of the patient that you see on the right than you do see on the left. And what happens is, this is when you start thinking about this, these are patients that we see on a day-to-day basis. In my practice, you'll see more like on the picture on the right. In other practices, you'll see a lot more pictures on the left. Like case in point, I have the honor and privilege of teaching with Dr. Joe Masad. And Dr. Masad sees primarily patients here on the left. So about 85% of his practice, give or take, is going to be patients that come in with dentures that need implants. Where on the flip side, about 85% of my practice, give or take, is going to be patients that you see on the right. So to each his own, however way that you feel is appropriate in your practice, whether you're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, like Dr. Masad, in California, or wherever you're tuning in from this webinar, I can promise you, everybody, there are patients just like this. 25 to 30 million people in just the USA need full arch reconstruction today. And it's growing because our patients are getting older and the baby boom population shift is still happening. So our patients that are older have a disproportionately higher level of missing teeth than the younger population. So young in my practice is 55, That would be young. And I love it, right? Listen, some of my patients, they come in diapers too. I know. But no, they're the sweetest people. And I love treating some of my more mature patients because a lot of those patients that come in wearing dentures, historically, we can treat them really well. Put a 2 to 4 implant overdenture, anterior mandible, patient's happy. They're just looking for something a little bit more stable. Versus those patients that come in with a failing dentition, typically they'll be steered more towards a full arch fixed restoration, like a screw retained Bruxer type restoration, or an overdenture. Either of those are good. It's usually just breakdown by price and cleansability, and then also the patient's desire. So now if we start thinking about a contemporary model of clinical practice, yeah, we have the complete failing dentition or complete denture. Typically in my practice, generally, I steer the patient at least towards a 4 implant overdenture per arch whenever possible. And then the screw retained full arch case is still the premium option, the best. And now there's this middle option of the locator fix. It fits in price wise as well as treatment speed wise in between the two. So there's a few articles I've written on this over the years, just in our condensed webinar type program here, this program. We won't have time to go through all the philosophy, but high level, you can go to my website, michaelscheerdmd.com, look up these articles, and go ahead and check out some of the philosophies, implant positions, future planning, prosthetic space, etc. Because what I can tell you, everybody, too, is that, as I mentioned, the two passions that I've, philosophy changes, I should say, over these past number of years in my practice is number one, more implants per arch. Number two, try to eliminate cantilevers whenever possible, whether they're on removable or fixed. Again, removable restoration doesn't really have a true cantilever, but I found it's kind of like a four-legged table in terms of stability versus a four-legged stool. Like the further that you spread your implants apart, in my opinion, you get a more stable restoration, whether it's true for fixed or removable. And so, it's just a philosophy that's carried myself. And what I can tell you is that it's totally fair, everybody, to look at me and say, wow, that's a crazy number of implants. Why? Just why? It's ridiculous. And that's totally fair. It's a fair critique. What I can tell you is, again, like I said, it's just my own personal philosophy. And I know that one that's been embraced by quite a few clinicians out there, just for an implantology perspective. And then you can also raise the comment like, well, you just mentioned that you're trying to make it more affordable for your patients, but you're adding more implants. Yeah. And a part of how I do that too is that I do run a combined restorative and implant practice, so I can keep the cost controlled for my patients. There's quite a few cases where I do work with my local oral surgeons or local periodontists. And in those cases, certainly I do have to either have a conversation with my surgeon or potentially raise the prices. Whenever possible, I find the most affordability is in that combined implant and restorative practice. So when we start thinking about those restorations, there's a lot of factors that go into them and trying to make them work. And none of us really want to deal with complications, problems, issues in our prosthetics. And this is just a snapshot of some of the problems I've seen over the years. Implant dentistry is really not too tough, everybody, right? You drill the hole, you put the implant in. I know I just sugar-coated surgery, and I take it very seriously. Don't get me wrong. But in theory, it's a pretty straightforward procedure. You can hang a picture on the wall. The mechanics of implant dentistry are straightforward. The key is just like, if you hire somebody to hang something up on the wall, you're hoping that they've got the training to know exactly where to put the nail, not just to pound the nail. And that's how I look at dentistry. We sit on education. We take more courses. We take full in-person courses like the wonderful courses at Glidewell to learn where to put the nail, and then also why to put the nail in a certain position or the screw, etc. And a part of that too is understanding the restorative plan, because when we start breaking down, what our restoration needs to go into position, it's always restoratively driven, everybody. And especially when you're working with a laboratory, just like Glidewell, there's such an incredible knowledge base that can help you as a clinician, because the key is, everybody, the restoration is what the patient's looking for. Even though I get a lot of patients who come to my practice that say, listen, I want implants, what they really mean is they want teeth but in the forms of something anchored or permanent, right? And so what happens now is if you look at the health or the journey of the patient, you start out natural teeth, you take out that tooth, and you put the straight implant in, you do an FP1, great. And then you lose that, or maybe you jump right to denture, then you lose a little bit of bone. Temptation is to do a minimally invasive surgery, flapless, put the implant in. That works in a lot of patients, but not in every patient. Some patients, we do need to go ahead and provide that space. So that way, when the patient pops their denture out, they drop it, something of that nature, or they bite on something, it doesn't break, right? We don't want to get that call from the patient. It's a Tuesday morning, and all of a sudden, doctor, my denture broke last night, and I'm leaving on a cruise this afternoon. Fix me, right? That happens. That's a part of doing dentistry. And so how we account for that too is we want to make sure that we have the proper restorative position where the implants go, the right angle, the right position, and then also the right prosthetic space. So as a general rule, with a locator overdenture or any sort of overdenture that uses a stud style attachment, whether it's a locator or something very similar, those cases require approximately 8 to 9 to 11 millimeters of vertical height. This is how we get this number. And then also you need about 3 to 5 millimeters of acrylic all the way around that locator housing. So then that way it doesn't have a higher chance of fracture, right? And sometimes we do cheat on that. Don't get me wrong. I know that. Every millimeter that we trim away from either the height or the lateral width can weaken the prosthesis. So as a general rule, yes, we can add a frame to strengthen it, but that increases cost. It also increases complexity. So whenever possible, I always try to make sure I get my implant in that position. And it's not super crazy difficult for us to do that. I typically measure this from a cone beam. So when the patient has natural teeth, we're going towards immediate denture. Like I mentioned, a big part of my practice is taking out teeth, placing implants at the time of extraction, and then placing a prosthesis over. In those cases, on the cone beam, measure from the incisal edge position with a ruler down 9 to 11 millimeters, and that's where my implant platform goes. Put it in the virtual software, and then I back measure and say, oh, I'm about 4 millimeters below the edentulous ridge or the bony ridge. I'm going to do alveoplasty of 4 millimeters. Okay. And then if we don't have the CBCT, no problem. You can also do that with a surgical guide. Have Glidewell, make a surgical guide for you, either a copy of the patient's immediate denture or a digital version of that as well. And then if we compare and contrast that to a traditional screw retained fix, you just need a little bit more space, everybody. You need, around that 15 millimeters of space. That's the vertical space, and also still that 3 to 5 millimeters of space all the way around, your screw channel or your housings to be able to increase the ability of the patient to have minimal complications long term. And I respect this because my patients, they put a lot of faith and trust in me, and also in the form of dollar bills. Dentistry can be expensive. So whenever possible, I want to be able to treat them and hopefully, knock on wood, that prosthesis lasts the patient, quote, a lifetime or as long as possible. Now, nothing is permanent, right? Anything in healthcare is always going to need some sort of revision, but it feels permanent to the patient. Okay. And then patient has minimal complications. And then that's a big part of my practice, everybody. Patients who come in saying, doctor, don't take this any offense, but I really hate going to the dentist. I said, no problem. I understand. They're not saying they hate me personally. They're saying they just don't like the process, which is every 6 months they go in, they need a new tooth work done. They need another $5,000 check that they got to write. And a lot of my patients say, doctor, don't be offended, but I don't like this process. And I'm retiring in a year or 2 years or 5 years, and I'm worried about healthcare costs in retirement. So if I take all my teeth out, what's my ongoing cost? Well, with a denture, you break the denture, it's $250, $500 to repair the denture. I can do it in 3-4 hours. I have a laboratory. I can send it to the laboratory, et cetera. Versus if you do this wonderful fixed treatment option, it's wonderful. But if you have a major complication, it could be several thousands of dollars to fix. In some patients, that could be the defining factor of them accepting plain old denture versus an implant overdenture versus a full arch fixed. So, looking at those contemporary options, part of today's presentation too, one thing that's really cool about this locator fixed system is in theory, you can restore your full arch fixed cases in less prosthetic space. Now, as a general rule, whenever possible, I always want to go ahead and still have as much as possible. So yes, you can restore full arch fixed in 9 to 11 millimeters of vertical prosthetic space, but you still need that 3 to 5 millimeters all the way around your housing to ensure that your prosthesis is long-term stable. Now, how does that work? You don't have the screw channels. It uses like a really strong snap as it pops into place. So it's plain, exact same locator abutment, just with a really strong snap. So there is no screw channel. So by not having that screw channel, you can go ahead and thin it down a fair amount. So let's look at a clinical case, everybody. So my patient comes to my practice, plain old denture patient. He's wearing immediate dentures. I made the immediate dentures on approximately a year ago, somewhere in that after this picture. Very medically complex patient. So the patient actually, just wanted to take a break from dentistry. Did fine during the immediate dentures, but we had to do the whole doctor, physician and consult, and the patient had to have special regimen. Patient was on blood thinners, etc. It was just exhausting for the patient. I offered to do implants at the time of extractions. The patient's like, no, 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 no. My cardiologist says absolutely minimal surgery is possible. So about a year after we're an immediate denture, patient comes in and says, Doc, I cannot live like this. So can you do something here where I can feel like I can actually live? I said, what do you mean by that? And he says, Doc, don't take any offense, but like teeth just don't work. And I said, I know. They're Band-Aid dentures, right? We need to be able to do something that's going to work for you. He says, Doc, I put my pennies in the jar. I've got money saved up. I've been talking to my cardiologist and I said, I can do one more procedure. Is there any way you can do this just without big surgery? And I said, let's take a look. So I did a cone beam on the patient, analyzed the cone beam, and I said, you know what? I actually feel like I can do this very minimally invasive without all the extra bone surgery that sometimes we would need to do. And in this particular case, I was able to do this flapless. So it's a pretty cool thing. So I worked with a laboratory to go ahead and generate a surgical guide. So this is just a pilot surgical guide. So the surgical guide just allows me to do the first hole. So the first hole sets the tone of the surgery case. And then after the first hole is prepared, then I go ahead and pull the guide off and do the rest of the case freehand. Just one approach. I'm not saying do this in every case, everybody tuning in. This is just one approach to doing implant dentistry on some of the patients I've treated over the years. And so after that guide comes off, then it's just a freehand surgery. As you can tell here, we had a decent amount of bleeding, but it still was pretty controlled, especially compared to elevating a large full flap. So in this particular case, because I used a cone beam and because my laboratory went ahead and was able to go ahead and generate the surgical guide, the whole purpose of generating this surgical guide, arguably everybody, when I had the lab go ahead and make the surgical guide, in this particular case, the whole reason was to go ahead and allow me to place implants in the posterior jaw. And the plan was to do an overdenture. And because I wanted to do it in a way that was trying to be as minimally invasive to the patient, we just did tissue punches, as minimal invasive surgery as possible. So yes, one can argue that maybe my soft tissue around a couple of the premolar implants could be better, maybe thicken it up a little bit. Totally fair critique. In this particular occasion, treating the patient as minimally invasive was the key. So in this particular example, we went ahead and had a immediate denture fabricated, and then I picked up the locator housings the day of the surgery. The implants all went in with pretty stable implant torque, or primary stability. So since all of the implants went in with at least 35 Newton centimeters, I was able to go ahead and snap on the housings and the blockout spacers onto the locators after torquing them down, of course, and then doing a chairside pickup, and then sending the patient out with this immediate denture that is stabilized. And he was never really that happy with the previous immediate denture that I made for him. So what we did was we had a new denture made, and that new denture was based upon the CBCT scan and plan. So the holes were already pre-cut out, so that way it was just a simple chairside pickup, and then the patient went on his merry way. And approximately 4 months later, give or take, patient came back in and did my recall visit. And keep in mind, patient accepted treatment for an overdenture. I was able to put one extra implant in here, arguably, yes, 5 implants per arch. Why? You could do 2 minimally invasive. Patient just wanted something more stable. I learned over the years, too, that if I can, I try to always exceed expectations, right? Treating denture patients is a little bit of an art form. Setting reasonable and realistic expectations is critical, everybody. But then whenever possible, I don't know, call it just part of the reason why I went into healthcare. I love to exceed patient expectations. And yeah, in this particular case, the patient only paid for a 4 implant overdenture, or maybe even 3. I can't remember what I charged the patient. I don't really even think that much about it. Why? Because I've realized too that implant dentistry, and a lot like dentistry is a gift. And by treating patients really, really well, this patient is now going to be my greatest advocate. And whether you do it complimentary or you do it at a reduced cost or you do it at a what you think is a fair cost or at a high cost, I would never tell you what to charge in your practice. All I can say is this particular patient, I did very well for myself. Don't worry. I definitely did well for myself. And this patient, I treated the person. He was so down and out about the implants. And I kind of had in the back of my mind, based upon some of the articles I was telling you about before, I had in the back of my mind that this patient may go to fixed at a later date. So I placed these implants with the thought of, gosh, if I ever needed to, I can always change this patient out to a full arts fixed restoration, maybe a screw retained bruxer or something of that nature. And then when the patient came back 4 months later after the surgery, he was wearing the denture that was snapped on the implants. And I said, hey, how you doing? And he goes, oh, doc, I'm doing great. And he no-showed my 1 week recall. He no-showed the 1 month recall. He came to the 4 month recall. Thank goodness, my dental assistant, incredible person, Tanya. So Tanya took the pano and said, doc, got the pano, looked at the pano. Wow, all these implants are great. And I looked at the pano before walking in the room. So I said, oh, hey, how you doing? He says, doc, I'm so comfortable. I didn't want to come back in. He says, well, what do you mean? He says, yeah, I've had the teeth in ever since. I said, but you're taking it out like I showed you, right? He says, no, doc, I've left it in. Oh, gross. So my patient left this denture in for 4 months. Okay. And I said, well, the good news is I took the x-ray. Everything looks really well healed. And I said, hold on. Popped out the prosthesis. Whew, held my breath a little bit, but the implants are all great. I had a little bit of soft tissue erythema, as you can see right around that lower right premolar. There was a lot of food and stuff caked inside of the denture. It was absolutely it was special. But once I removed it, cleaned it up, tissues were happy. And I learned a lesson by treating this patient, because this patient looked at me and he said, doc, he said, don't be offended, but I just really don't want to come in. I was happy. And you know what? I thought you told me that these teeth were going to be permanent. And I said to him, I said, well, they're stap-in teeth, my friend. Like, that's what you accepted. Oh, yeah, I know. But I leave them in because I want them to be permanent. I learned something that day. And what I learned too is that, when we look at our options in our clinical practice, the plain old denture is fine, everybody. I mean, there's a lot of patients out there that I treat with denture still. And I do a fair number of upper dentures or maxillary complete dentures without implants. Not a lot of patients can afford the surgery and the complexity of doing upper implants. However, the lower and the mandibular dentures, it can be a really, really big challenge when you start looking at, those lower dentures. $2,000 to $3,000 per arch. And we compare that, for the patients that have an implant retained, either 2 or 4 implant overdenture. It's secure, but there is still movement. It's removable, etc. And then on top of it here too, you compare that to the patient that may need a screw retained fixed full arch restoration. All of these are wonderful treatments, right? And like, as I mentioned earlier, historically, there's not really been anything in the middle ground. And so when I was treating my patient that I just showed you before, literally 4 months after doing it, then this locator fix thing came out. And I thought, gosh, this might be a really good option for this patient. Patient accepted treatment for an implant overdenture. I quoted the patient fee-wise for the implant overdenture. And then the patient's like, but doc, I was hoping these teeth would be permanent. Every one of my patients, I show them plain old denture, the 2 implant, the 4 implant overdentures, and then the screw retained full arch fixed. I always show them the models. Have them snap it on, feel it. My 2 implant overdenture rocks a little bit. The denture just flops around. The screw retained is incredible, but it's also more premium pricing, etc. And I explain that to the patient. And then I also explain to the patient too that there's this middle ground option that's a snap-in teeth. The prosthetic costs, the parts, it's a little bit more streamlined. I can pass along the cost savings of all of those things. And this is what I charge for it. And so in my patient example I showed you before, I gave him, the quote, and I just said, hey, listen, this new thing just came out, and it's not experimental. It's incredible. It's the same parts that you have in your mouth. It's just there's a slightly different way that the laboratory does it. And I said, this is what the cost would be to do that if you really want permanent teeth. And I said, I know I quoted you this much for the screw in, and that's still an option if you maybe want to go that direction. But there's this middle one right now. And he says, well, doc, it sounds great. I'll pay that. I said, I want my teeth to be permanent. So that started me thinking, right? How does this stuff work? Like I just started to think to myself, really? Locators, those are removable. Like they snap on, snap off, patient takes it in, takes it out. Like there's something called fixed, but is it really fixed? Yeah, it is really fixed. It's the exact same locator abutment, the exact same parts and impression copings and snaps, etc. And the cool thing is it's kind of almost the exact same technique of what we do in clinical practice. So like you saw in that patient example, surgery technique is very similar. The prosthetic technique is very similar. Where it does change though is Zest came out with a special housing and insert for the fixed. And there's new special inserts as shown here. Instead of the blue, pink, and clear for like retention levels, the blue is the lightest, clear is the heaviest. The inserts are based upon how many implants you have in the arch. And then finally, of course, the prosthesis is a little bit different. Instead of making a plain old denture with flanges, you want to make something that is a convex prosthesis, just like your traditional Bruxer all-on X type restorations. Same locator abutment, whether you have a locator abutment for any implant system, Nobel, Han, any implant system that takes a Zest locator as well, you can go ahead and restore with a locator fixed as well. And then also the removable versus fixed components, the impression copings, the analogs, the blockout spacers, all of the parts and pieces that Glidewell, your laboratory uses, are really pretty identical. So it's very straightforward to go ahead and do that. And the neat part is too is that since there is a new housing, the same like the locator movable, it comes with the insert, the processing insert. And then this was kind of cool, especially for this particular patient, because I wasn't really sure. Sometimes in my full arch practice, my full arch fixed patients come in with not so good hygiene. Like I told you that just funny little story about the patient not taking his dentures out. It's a true story. True story. The denture was special. Like it was like if I showed you the picture, it would be, oh man, I don't ever want to see that again. In the back of my mind, I was worried. Like, is this patient going to be able to keep their full arch fixed prosthesis clean? Hmm. One thing that's kind of cool I learned with the locator fixed is you can change from fixed to removable just by changing the little insert that goes into the housing. You can do that in the gold housings, but the traditional silver ones that we use right now for the overdentures can only accept the removable inserts. And I'm like, really? Oh man, that's a bummer. And then I was explained it's kind of like you buy a DVD player or a CD player. The CD player can accept CDs, but not DVDs. But the DVD player, which is new, you can accept both of them. So it's kind of like the DVD player. You could play CDs and DVDs with the new locator fixed housings. So as mentioned, there's 3 different colored inserts. The inserts have green inserts for the 4 implant cases. The tan and blue inserts are for your 5 implants or more. And then there's a chart configuration that you see down here in the bottom right that is available to go ahead and guide you on how to design that. You put the tans in the front, blues in the middle, and then tans in the back. For your 4 implant cases, it's always green inserts. So it uses the same abutment like I mentioned. Again, won't read all of these things, but the idea is that it just is for simplicity. Okay, less bone reduction if you have to, and then also a little bit more flexibility. Prosthetic space, as mentioned earlier, it can afford being able to do the full arch fixed in tighter prosthetic spaces. So more importantly, let's talk a little bit more about clinical workflows of full arch fixed and then doing it in a way that you use a snap-in type of system like locator fixed. So some classic routes of what you would see for clinicians like you, I, everybody tuning in, or our dental teams or lab technicians, et cetera, tuning in. A patient comes in with an existing 2 or 4 implant overdenture. Let's set aside the 2 implant overdenture for a second. Let's talk more about the 4 implant overdenture. Patient says to me, he says, Doc, it's loose, so it's wiggling, and I would love to be able to eat steak without stuff getting stuck underneath it, or is there anything else I could do? Or maybe another scenario, it's like, hey, Doc, I've saved up, put the pennies in the jar. Is there anything else other I can do than being able to take my teeth in and out? I'd love to have teeth that stay in, like they're permanent, quote unquote. I said, absolutely. We can take, your existing teeth. Okay, let's go back for a second. If it's in the traditional world where you're doing screw retain, yeah, okay, I've got your denture in place, no problem. You have these snap parts in. I have to unscrew those, and then we'll put on new parts called multi-units, and I'll make an impression. And then I'll put you into a temporary, and then it'll be 3 or 4 visits. I'll fit these parts, do all that. I says, okay, that's great. And it's going to be this much. And there's quite a few extra steps that go into that. Fabulous dentistry, screw retained, full arch, fabulous dentistry, just a few extra steps and a little bit more complexity. And then ultimately a little bit more parts, pieces, and cost. So I got to pass on to the patient. So what the locator fix system allows me to do is, same example, patient says, could I, do these permanent teeth? No problem. You drill out the housings that are in that current overdenture. Okay, drill out the housings. Now I have a plain old denture. Pop on the new gold housings onto the same locator abutments. Don't need to unscrew any implant parts or nothing, as long as they're locator abutments. Do the pickup in the mouth, just like I would do for an overdenture, and then trim the prosthesis back into a fixed temporary. Then what I can do is digitally scan that 360 degrees if I'm using a digital process, or I can do a reference denture process, or I can just do a traditional PVS impression. Patient's mouth. And then next visit, 3D printed try-in or tooth try-in. Next visit is delivery. Pretty cool. And then if we want to step back a little bit and say, wow, man, all this fancy digital stuff. Hey, I do my dentures with PVS and stone models. Totally great. So do I. I still do quite a few dentures out there analog. It's good dentistry. You can do your analog step by step, 4 to 6 visits. I'll explain a little bit more. But the idea of this is that it can be done both analog, digital, as well as a conversion technique. So let's step back a little bit and talk a little bit about, hey, what are the conventional ways of doing overdentures? What's the analog way? Y'all, this stuff works. Like the way that we learned in dental school, the way that we still do, it's just good dentistry, everybody. And so when we look at this, the analog workflows, it's make an alginate impression, pour it up in a stone cast, send it to the lab, make a custom tray. Custom tray comes back to you, make a PVS impression, border mold, PVS, isofunctional, whatever material that you use, green stick compound, or just whatever, alginate. All of this works. Then you go to your wax rims, do the bite record in the patient's mouth, then you trim the wax rims, measure the teeth, etc. Go to the next step. Laboratory sets the teeth, comes back to you. You do the clinical try-in, make sure the bite's right, the vertical, smile, the speech, and then laboratory takes over, processes the denture, and boom. You've got your denture, you've got your overdenture, or you potentially have even your screw retained fix. So this is classic. And sometimes we look at this and say, God, I want to do this in 2 visits. Great. There's a lot of opportunity to do this in quicker, faster, etc. But then also when stuff doesn't work, it's a good idea to revert back to this technique. There's nothing wrong with doing it a couple of extra steps to get it right. Or there's nothing wrong with doing it faster, so long as you understand the method as well as it works for you. Because, for some folks, like my two visit may not work for others, or another person's 2 visit may not work for me. We've got to try these techniques, and education is the key. So attending the education and seeing different approaches. So the digital approach, which is one of my favorites. I just love digital dentistry, everybody. And I know what a wonderful thing that, you're tuned into the laboratory that really leads the way in digital, here at Glidewell. And so what happens is if you start thinking about digital dentistry, I can make a standard alginate too. I can skip that. Or I could have a 3D printed custom tray, or maybe I skip all the custom trays and go to maybe a stock tray, like Dr. Massad's stock tray or Wagner tray, etc., and use a custom tray in 1 visit. Totally cool. So we skip the first 2 steps. We go straight to the final impression. Maybe I will use PVS in this particular case. There's no rules that say if you do a digital prosthesis, it has to be all done digitally in the mouth, or it has to be all done in 1 technique. Just like another clinician's 2 or 3 visit technique may be vastly different from your other technique or another technique shown somewhere else. That's the neat part about dentures, overdentures, and screw retained full arch, which is, it's a lot of times an art form too. So yeah, we can do a wax rim, traditional stone model, 3D printed wax rim, go to the try-in. We can do a digital setup. And the laboratory can go ahead and 3D print the digital setup, do the clinical try-in, all of these different things, and then finish it up. So this is, just a snapshot of digital. And it looks very similar to what you would see with the traditional analog. It's just injecting some digital. You could do 4 out of 5 of these steps as analog and then do the final step as digital. You can do the first 3 steps as digital, do the next 2 as analog, and then the last step is digital. And you're still doing digital dentistry, right? So sometimes we call this digilog as a combination of digital and analog. But everybody, one of my favorite techniques of doing digital locator fixed techniques is going to be what's called the reference denture. So it's basically taking the patient's existing prosthesis, making a wash impression on the inside of the prosthesis in the patient's mouth, the patient biting in occlusion, and then scanning that 360 degrees, scanning the upper, then putting the prosthesis in the mouth and scanning the bite on each side, and sending a 360-degree scan of the patient's lower or whatever prosthesis arch it is with the opposing and occlusion. Send it to the laboratory, and then more or less, the entire process can be done just by using this. Because inside of that 360-degree scan is going to be all the anatomy that you need, including where the locator abutments are, where the future housings are going to be, etc. Now, not shown here, you can also inject maybe instead of a 2-visit digital denture, you do a 2.5 visit. So you ask the lab to go ahead and 3D print a try-in after essentially this middle step here, and then stop. I'm going to do a try-in in the patient's mouth before I go to fine. Totally fine. Totally fine. So there's flexibility here. And then on top of it too, there's another digital workflow too that you can use, something called copy denture. Take the patient's existing denture and then copy denture it, or better yet, like with a locator fix, you could take that converted denture. Hypothetically, a patient comes in with a overdenture. You remove the housings, do a pickup of the fixed inserts or the housings, trim it all back freehand, and then make it the size and shape that you want to make your definitive prosthesis. And then scan that in the patient's mouth 360 degrees, or pardon me, remove it from the patient's mouth, scan 360 degrees, put it back in the mouth, scan the upper and then the bite, send that digital scan along, and then the prosthesis can be made from there as well. So just high level in terms of what we see here too, of the clinical approach, clinical technique of a few different digital workflows. So when we start thinking about prosthetic options for all of our full arch cases, and then especially for locator fixed, there's quite a few main 3 options, or main 5, give or take. But the main 3 definitive options of what you would see for your locator fixed prosthesis is typically going to be like PMMA with a metal frame. Could be titanium, could be cobalt chrome, digitally produced PMMA, or analog heat processed denture teeth over the top. I definitely think of this as like a little bit more of like a middle ground or budgetary option. And then the top option is going to be something like a zirconia restoration, such as like a Bruxer full strength or Bruxer aesthetic, depending upon the patient. And these are wonderful treatment options. Most of the time, from my experience, this is where a lot of clinicians prefer to go for their locator fix, just because you get a really happy medium between strength and aesthetics. And then with the zirconia, that 9 to 11 millimeters of prosthetic space, preferably a little on the higher end, can really give you some nice long-term results for your patients as well. It's a very exciting time to be in dentistry, and then also to be able to do this with high-strength zirconia, such as the Bruxer zirconia. And then other clinicians do like to go ahead and use like some sort of polymer frame, something of that nature, like a milled prosthesis over a polymer frame, just as another definitive treatment option. And then you have a couple of other options that are the digitally produced. Many would consider these bottom 2 options as kind of like the long-term temporary or long-term interim prosthesis. So something like a 3D printed prosthesis or a milled PMMA prosthesis with a layered pink composite. Certainly reach out to your laboratory team, your representative at Glidewell, to ask about the treatment options, and certainly get a breakdown of exactly what works best for you in your clinical practice. So when we start to think about now this patient's come back here at recall, that patient now is on recall and says, "Doc, hey, I really want some teeth that don't come in, come out, etc." What our goal is that if we take a look at this too, we know that I can pop on the impression copings, make a standard PVS impression, just do it quickie, right? Patient comes into the practice. I didn't have a custom tray ready. I didn't have all these things. And really, arguably, I don't think you really need the custom tray here because we're making a fixed prosthesis, not a denture. So stock impression tray, PVS impression, heavy body, light body on the locator impression coping, snap it onto the arch, And then I went ahead, we got a stone model poured up. So the stone model was poured up and a wax rim was fabricated for that restoration. So one thing I do like to see in my wax rims is the housings in the wax rim. What happens now is when I take a look at this, now it's a stabilized record base, comes back to me. Then I bring the patient back in, remove the temporary prosthesis, snap on the wax rims, and then do the bite records in the patient's mouth with a nice stabilized record base, which is a little bit nicer than something where it just kind of flops around. And then as I go ahead and check the wax rim, adjust as necessary, I make sure that the vertical, the centric, and speaking sound is on target for what I would like to be. I send it back, and then the teeth are set on the stone model. Could be on a 3D printed model as well, totally fine. But the stone model now has denture teeth on the wax rim. Patient comes back into the office, pop that in, snap it in. Wow, doctor, this feels like my denture. No problem. This is just a test run for what we're doing here. So then I check the bite, check the aesthetics, and make sure that we're on the right track. And overall, everything looks pretty good. We're pretty close. And then the patient's like, well, but doctor, it's too thick here. I said, hang tight. We're just doing this as a trial run. Your final teeth are going to be smooth and contoured. And I pulled out the model, showed him what the teeth will look like. And he goes, oh, okay, that makes sense. This is like, you're just making some measurements. Exactly. So the teeth will be there, and then you're going to have a much thinner base here as well. And if I'm ever unsure to everybody, I can always stop, tell the patient, like if I have a patient who's really particular or they're just really unknown, I can convert from here and do a trial run of like a PMMA, like a prototype restoration. So I can have a prototype restoration made out of all PMMA and then do a pickup of the fixed housings in there and then deliver that for the patient to wear a month, just to dial in the occlusion. And that's really a good idea for zirconia as well, because that way you make sure the bite's right. The patient's pretty happy with the size of the teeth, because once you invest in the Bruxer zirconia, if you need to make any changes to it, you got to make a new prosthesis, right? But if there's any major changes, like the patient says, "Oh, doctor, I want the a tooth to be a little wider here, or this front tooth to be a little bit more crooked or a little bit more natural." Yeah, when you're in the prototype try-in, patient wears that for a month. If a change needs to be made, no problem. Take a picture, make a mold, send it in, and then that can be adjusted, either a new prototype made to test it out for another month, or you can go straight to zirconia at that point. So in this particular case, the patient was pretty happy and really was motivated to get this done kind of quick. So I said, no problem, let's go ahead and do this. And so I then say to myself, okay, well, what's my plan? One thing that I found really kind of interesting about the locator and overdenture in general is over the years, I've started doing a lot more chair side pickup of my overdentures. And part of the reason for that is I've learned personally over the years, I like being able to do a chairside pickup. It's streamlined, it's really predictable. It's a little extra time for me on delivery appointment. I do like lab processed overdentures quite a bit, but in certain situations, if I'm a little bit nervous, like, hey, did I maybe have a little bit of impression error, or maybe something might have moved during the technique, or when I'm in the wax rim with those little housings in the wax rim, and God, all of them snap in good. Maybe this one's not so good over in here. I'll have the laboratory leave the holes cut out. So then that way I can do a chair side pickup. So I tell my technician to go ahead and leave the holes cut out. And then I just do a chair side pickup. So let's talk high level, some recommendations of the two options in front of us. So there's laboratory process, meaning Glidewell will have this ready for you. You can do it in the laboratory, or you can do it chairside pickup as well. I'll talk about the pros and cons of each, because there's quite a few clinicians that do both, or one or the other. So the pros of having laboratory process technique is there's no chairside attachment processing required. It is a faster delivery appointment, meaning it comes back, it's got the locator housings already finished in the denture, or the locator fixed prosthesis, and then I literally pop it in and I'm done. That's pretty awesome. It's like a 5-minute delivery, and the patient's like, oh my gosh, that was incredible. Everybody's happy when it works, right? And it works the vast majority of times. But there are some time in some cases, it's hard to predict, everybody, where it's just like I don't know, from my experience in my own, even in my own hands, it's like maybe 9 out of 10 work great. And then there's that one case where I'm like, one side snaps in really good, but the other side is bouncy a little bit. And I'm like, it's good enough. Or like, I'll see when the patient comes back in. And the patient's like, doctor, this side pops out easier than this side. Can you make this side tighter? Sometimes that's just due to little tiny errors of material processing, or maybe the impression wasn't, perfectly ideal, etc. In those particular cases, it's hard to predict. Now, yes, I could drill out just that one housing, do a new chair side pickup of that one, no big deal. But I've learned over the years too that, there's two approaches here. You can have the laboratory process. It's pretty streamlined, pretty straightforward. But there's always a slight chance that there could be some error or deviation. And then also a slightly higher chance of increased maintenance long-term. But it's a very popular technique for clinicians to go ahead and receive back a fully processed locator or overdenture or, something of that nature. Now, chairside pickup, also option number 2. It's very predictable and streamlined. Why? Because I know essentially 100% of the time. I have the holes cut out, get the prosthesis, put the snaps on, inject a little bit of material into the recesses, have the patient lightly close into occlusion, pick it up, pop it out, polish it up a little bit, like 100 times out of 100, essentially almost always works, right? And what I can tell you too is that it's really ideal long-term. And I know it's a little extra time at the delivery appointment. We all want to make that streamlined. But one thing that I really don't want to do is have a patient come back quite a few more times and say, doctor, I'm coming back in, it's loose again. I have it snap in perfect I change the inserts, it snaps out. Oh, doc, that feels great. Patient comes back every 2 weeks because it's loose. The doctor was great when I left that day, but then a week later got a little bit looser, but now here I am because it's really loose. In those particular cases, what I can tell you after doing so many overdenture cases and guiding clinicians all over, that almost all of those generalized fit issues of your locator overdentures can be fixed by removing the housings and doing a new chairside pickup of that same prosthesis. And typically, the best way to do it is to remove all the housings, pick up all the housings again. Now, yes, you can pick up just the one that may be loose, and that generally does work. But the most predictable thing is to repick up all the housings. So I don't know. I made the choice in my practice that I just said, you know what? I'm going to always pick up my prosthetics, and I find a lot of predictability with that. Because clinicians, one of the most important thing that we do is predictability. And then also, yes, it is more steps at the delivery appointment and increased chair time. So in this particular case, I felt very confident coming back to my 5 implant case on the mandibular arch. I felt pretty confident in my impression with the technique. The wax rim snapped on really nice. So in this particular case, we did lab processed housings for this arch. And we did the metal bar with a denture teeth over the top. Kind of more of like a budget prosthesis, just because the zirconia choice was going to be a little bit more expensive here. I gave the patient that option, but because the cost of the prosthesis here was already a bit of a stretch for the patient since he accepted overdenture treatment, we decided to go ahead and do the more budgetary option in this particular case and snap it in. Patient's like, oh my gosh, bit down, felt pretty comfortable. And as a general rule, whenever we're doing our try-in of our prosthetics for our locator fixed, it's always a good idea to go ahead and have some of these processing inserts, the black processing inserts available. So then that way we can try the prosthesis in with the black processing inserts. That's the way we ideally want it to come back from the lab. Then this pops it on. We want to check to make sure that all of them fit. So if you're doing the lab process, I want to check, pop the side in, pop the side in. It should feel tight. It shouldn't rock. If it rocks, then we do want to most likely remove the housings and do another pickup. It should feel tight. And then we want to check the bite, the aesthetics, and the speech before we change to the final inserts. So now we're going to go ahead and say, yep, it checked out. Patient was pretty happy. And I took the prosthesis out. We recontoured, smoothed it off a little bit because in this particular case, we wanted to just get nice and smooth. Then we're changing over to the tan and blue inserts, which is what's indicated for the 5 implant cases. So it'll be tan in the front, the back, and blues in the middle. Once we confirm that, the locator abutments are cleaned off. Just make sure I do a little quick prophy of the actual locator abutments. Make sure there's no food, debris, or calculus inside of them. And then the prosthesis now goes into the patient's mouth, and we just go snap it in. I've found from experience, the vast majority of the time I can seat it with my fingers, but as a good general rule, we're going to go ahead and use the patient's bite, either with cotton rolls, or Zest makes a little tool that just goes pop, pop, almost like a crown and bridge tapper tool that'll seat the inserts in the posterior and the anterior just to be on the safe side. How do you remove these prostheses if there's no screws? Same thing. There's a little tool that's got a little hoop end on it that goes behind the prosthesis that gives a bit of a tug, and it pops off. And many of these also like you say, you say to yourself, hey, I want to see how that tool works. Go to my website, michaelscheerdmd.com, and click on YouTube videos. You can see I've got tons of videos on there of using tools, all these different things, and also fundamental overdentures. Like if you want to see how to use the original core tool for your overdenture cases, all the way up to what prosthetic options, what tools and instruments should I use for locator fix? It's on my YouTube channel. I have one YouTube channel called Learn Locator, which you go to youtube.com/learn locator. I got a ton of videos on there too, step-by-step procedures to follow up for you as well. So I certainly know that our webinar program is a little bit on the Kinet side. Right in here, now you can see our final prosthesis. It's always a good idea, everybody, to take an x-ray of our full arch prosthetics, whether it's screw retained or locator fixed, prior to dismissing the patient. So in this particular case, I'm pretty confident I seated it. Check it with an x-ray. Everything fits good. If you're ever unsure, one thing that's very important, as I hinted at earlier, the patient wearing in the black processing inserts, I want to try that in before going to the final inserts, everybody. Check the bite, check the aesthetics, check the speech. Why? Because if I snap in my final prosthesis and the patient's like, oh, doctor, the bite feels high on this side. This side, I need to click the little tool to seat that side down a little bit more, because if the bite changes between the processing inserts, the black processing inserts to the finals, chances are it's lifted up a little bit in the back. So pop that side in. Oh, wow, doctor, that feels better now. Perfect. Take the x-ray, make sure everything fits. All right. So it's pretty cool, everybody. And also, as we start to wrap up this webinar, we have time for questions and answers. So make sure there's the Q&A box right here on our webinar program. Make sure plenty of time for questions. I saved some time here. I just want to give a nice little shout out here to the entire team at Glidewell. So this is just a little screenshot from the Glidewell website as well. And there's a ton of resources available to you as well. And then also a really, really incredible prosthetic option and offering available to you from Glidewell for both multiple types of restorations, and certainly reach out to the team here at Glidewell to give you more information on that. And on that note too, like I mentioned, it's been an honor and privilege to go ahead and participate in this webinar program. Here's my contact information, social channels. Make sure you reach out anytime, especially if I don't have time to get to your question. Feel free to reach out anytime. I'm always approachable, happy to go ahead and help guide, even if it's on overdentures. Doesn't have to be just on one or the vast majority. Like I said, very sincere over the years. I've learned treating people, the golden rule is how I built my practice. And it's been a wonderful thing in doing that with budget options, medium priced options, such as locator fix, all the way up to premium options like screw retain, Brooks, or restorations, etc. Here's my website, michaelscheerdmd.com. Like I said, thank you all for tuning in. And looks like Dr. Park, I see you back on. Happy to be able to take some time to answer any questions.
I am back on, and I've been collecting all the questions during this past hour. So the first thing I want to say is to thank you for this wonderful lecture. Anyone that watched this lecture knows that you are an experienced and caring clinician, and you're right on the cutting edge of technology. So it's great to have you come and share your knowledge with us. The second thing I want to say is that we're going to go ahead and give everybody 90 minutes or 1.5 CEUs for this program, because I'm going to keep Dr. Scherer to answer these questions, because we've got so many good ones. So let me just jump right in, Mike, if you don't mind. What are your thoughts on mini implant supported restorations? You didn't mention that in the overall options.
Yeah, absolutely. So what it comes down to is I've always been a fan of smaller diameter implants, not just biggies. Minis are totally great as well, especially, like when you combine them with either overdentures or other types of restorations. Now, what it comes down to this is when we're looking at mini implants or narrow diameter implants, one of the things that's always been kind of like the critique is like, oh gosh, any implant that's smaller than 3.0 millimeters is not really a quote real implant. That's such hogwash. Over these years, I have placed a lot of narrow diameter implants, both 2.4, 2.9, and other types of implants as well, with a tremendous amount of success, especially on the mandibular arch. Now, in the maxillary arch, yeah, it's a different story. That's true of any implant, though, right? So whenever possible, that's part of, Dr. Park, how I've adopted my philosophy over these years, which is putting in a few extra implants over, per arch. And I learned a lot from the docs that have done a lot of minis. They place a few extras just as backups. And I always thought that was like, gosh, this is kind of defeatist. Like, that's my gut reaction. But then once you start to realize like what we're doing, which is treating people. Okay. Yeah. As a general rule, if I do a cone beam and I've got big wide bone, I'm going to put a larger diameter implant. I want the surface area. But if I've got cases where I go, yeah, I've got thinner bone, or you know what? Here's my target. If I'm using a smaller arrow to hit that target and the literature shows that they still work well, absolutely. So I've been placing narrow diameter implants for almost 12 years or so, give or take, in very few complications. I'm very happy with them.
Great, thank you. Okay, and here's an interesting question. A lot of times we get a question that should best be answered with a 2-day lecture, but instead we're going to give you 90 seconds. So if you have a limited number of implants, so for whatever reason you have to place fewer implants than you would prefer to place, is it better to spread the implants apart to reduce cantilevers and spread the load out, or is it better to put them closer together for better load transfer?
Yeah, Dr. Parker, that's a great question. I know a lot of times the temptation is we have to balance out. Let me rephrase that. There's a key to balancing this, right? So the question is should I put my implants further apart, narrowly together? We have to kind of start reframing this. Why are we seeing a lot of implants that are really closely spaced, like in the anterior of the lower or the upper? A big reason is that we're concerned about surgical anatomy, placing implants in the posterior jaw, softer bone on the posterior mandible maxilla, closer to anatomical structures such as nerve tissues, mental foramina, undercuts, etc. And in those particular cases, absolutely, there is a good reason to placing implants only in this interforaminal space. You get good treatment. It's predictable. As a general rule for any implant, whether they're narrow diameter or standard diameter, I want to put them at least 3 millimeters apart, edge of the implant to edge of the implant. So whether I put them all in the front or spread them across the arch, we get good results. Now, that being said, I did publish a few papers over the years where we've analyzed this. And what we found is, like I mentioned a little bit in the program presentation, if you take your chair that you're sitting in right now, or you can compare that to the table that's right in front of you, if you're at a dining room table or your coffee table where your couch is, the legs of the chair, when they're kind of narrowly spaced, like this or like right in here, versus widely spaced, the one that's going to have a wider spaced leg is going to be a little bit more stable. All right. And the same thing is true in the mouth. So whenever possible, I always try to spread out the implants as much as possible. And the key to that is I have to go back to where my back brain was just commenting earlier. I get nervous. Like, oh my gosh, am I drilling? Is it close to the nerve? I don't know. I get nervous. I take the cone beam. And that's the key, is I take a cone beam, make sure I've got bone in the posterior, and then I place a couple of shorter, wider implants in the posterior. And then heck, I'll put 4 minis in the front, 2 wider diameter, shorter implants in the posterior. What a great service to the patient.
Great, thank you. You showed a surgical case where you used what we call a pilot guide, where you didn't do fully guided surgery all the way to placing the implant. You just did your first couple of drills. What's the advantage of a pilot guide over a fully guided treatment?
Yeah, great question. So guided surgery is a wonderful thing. So over these years, I've gotten to the point in my practice that almost 100% of my cases, I use some sort of surgical guide with guided surgery. Almost 100%. I just love it. Now, does that mean that I always use the surgical guide in the surgery? Not always. Not always. I just have it there available because it's like having my lab technician or my radiologist right there on my shoulders is saying, you might want to consider that. And that makes me comfortable the day of surgery. And then the second thing too is, this is regardless of type of surgical guide, I genuinely believe that guided surgery is less about surgery and more about prosthetics. So coming back to your comment too, if I just simply use a pilot guide, then the pilot guide gets me that first hole. It gives me the angle of that first hole, gives me the depth of that first hole. It could be just a 2.0 pilot, it could be a 2.1, it could be 2.3, whatever size it is. It will give me about 80 to 85% of the positioning of where I'm going to place that implant. And so then at that point, surgical guide comes out. You can open up a small flap, take a 15 blade right on the crest of the edentulous ridge, open up a flap, see the bone, and then say, gosh, okay, now I'm doing freehand surgery, but I've got that little person saying, yep, I gave you that starting point. You're at 85%. Now you do the rest 15%. I love that. What I've also learned over the years is I love fully guided surgery. The only problem with fully guided surgery is that there's a little bit of deviation that you have to account for with fully guided surgery, especially on the edentulous mandible. Fully guided is incredible, but it's a lot more complex. You got to put anchor pins in. You got to go ahead and potentially have a stackable situation. You have to build in a lot more stuff that goes into it. I really do like the KISS rule. So I like pilot guides. I'd say probably about 90 to 95% of my surgeries are with a pilot guide only. Now, that being said, what I ask, the guide to come back though, it's got the big hole and the big cylinder with the sleeve, but I can do the fully guided, the whole case, or I can just stop at the first two drills. There's no rules that say you order a guide, you got to do the whole thing through the guide. You can stop at the first two drills, right?
Good point. And I could also see, like, let's say if you need to do some hard or soft tissue grafting at the time of placement, it'll be a lot easier to do it without the guide in place. So,
No doubt.
but I think that's a really good reminder for people that if you know where the implant is, if you put the first couple drills in,
Yeah.
you don't have to finish with it. And great point. Great point. Here's a good question: is the pickup material the same for the fixed locator as it is for the locator overdenture?
Yeah, Dr. Park, great question. So the short answer to that is yes. So depending upon what technique you like to use for your existing overdentures, if you use cold cure PMMA to pick up your dentures, you can do that also with locator fixed. If you use chair side APM or attachment processing material or something like Voco Quick Up, all of those materials are perfectly fine to also use with locator fixed. Now, with a little asterisk, as a general rule, that's true of most prosthetics. However, with zirconia, I do recommend a resin cement for picking up zirconia arches in the mouth. So, something like a Panavia, Sem-Easy, Multi-Link in those particular restorations for zirconia.
What about okay, so you do it yourself even for a zirconia restoration. You'll pick it up in the mouth.
Yes. There are times, like I mentioned, I may decide on certain patients to do it in the laboratory. I do love laboratory processed zirconia restorations. It's clean, it's smooth, but I've picked up quite a bit of zirconia locator fixed in the mouth with a high degree of precision as well as reliability. I just really do love chairside pickup whenever possible.
Great, great. Okay, and for the locator fixed, you showed how the technique is for removing it. Is that something a patient can do themselves, or is that only something the doctor does?
Exactly. Great question. So to remove the locator fixed prosthesis, it's a specialized tool that's got almost like a crown and bridge tapper on it. So it just goes and it pops off. And the idea of that tool is that it's only done by the clinician or the dental auxiliary. So the patients are not able to remove these prosthetics. And listen, even me was like, I was a little bit of a disbeliever, like, really? But they just snap in. Okay, patient can pop it off. No, it's on there strong. Yeah, I've yet to hear of too many patients that can remove any of these prosthetics or something. It's truly fixed. It's truly fixed. So the nice thing about locator fix, though, is like screw retained. One thing that I don't particularly love about when patients come in back into my office that have screw retained full arch zirconia is removing the zirconia for cleaning, for hygiene. I always try to do that whenever possible, maybe once a year, maybe once every 18 months to 24 months or so, depending upon the patient. Some patients have to do it sooner because of hygiene, et cetera. In those cases, I got to go over to the hygienist, drill out the holes, find the holes, unscrew the prosthesis. No problem. It's something I don't mind doing, but it adds 20 minutes, 30 minutes onto my appointment. So then I have to charge for it. Versus the nice thing is with locator fixed, pops off in about 15 to 30 seconds, and I can delegate to my hygienist or my dental assistant to use the tool to pop the locator fixed prosthesis off, unlike I can't delegate to my dental assistant to remove the screw retained bridge.
Got it. Got it. I really like the way you kind of brought us up to date on the different digital denture options. That was a really good, very quick overview. So on what you've referred to as the reference denture technique, if the patient, do we always have to take a wash impression? So let's say the patient is really delighted with the way it fits, and it's just starting to get a little old and crusty. Can you just scan it the way it is?
Absolutely. So the question is can I just duplicate the patient's denture or make a new one? Or maybe even like say, I've got an all acrylic. I want to do an overdenture or a locator fixed prosthesis now with a framework in it and everything else looks great. It touched the soft tissue. Everything's great. Yeah. Pop it out, scan just the prosthesis 360 degrees. There's no rules that say you have to use a PBS impression on the inside of the patient's denture. In fact, I had one patient, kind of a fun little side story. One patient drove 3.5 hours or so to my practice one time. And she says, Doc, I said, she said, I've been to quite a few other dentists that, I've got this denture that was made in 1965 or whatever it was. And I just said to the doctor, just make me this exact thing, but a new denture. And everybody, like we're trained in dental school, you always tell the denture patient, we got to put your expectations lower. We can't do that. It's going to be similar. And they come in with the baggie of dentures. We've all had those patients. Took that patient's denture, 360-degree scan of the patient's denture, and then had a milled denture made exactly the same size and shape. And I think I saw her for one visit after that, and I'm like, bye.
She loved it. Yeah, somebody finally listened to her, right?
Yeah, I know.
It's amazing. Sometimes the patients know exactly what they want. That's a great story. I'm going to finish with this one question, and I didn't get to all the questions. And you have so generously offered your website for people to answer questions. You're a very much dedicated teacher. I've seen you work with so many practitioners, and so please don't feel free to reach out to Dr. Scherer with questions. He's a great source. But this was in your locator fixed, I guess because it's positioned somewhere between an overdenture and a fixed prosthesis. People are asking questions about what is your occlusal scheme. And I want to just remind everybody that next week, Dr. Randy Resnick will be back talking about occlusion. And actually, that's his topic, is occlusion on fixed implant restorations in 2 weeks. So, but go ahead and just if you would answer that about whether you do lingualized occlusion for the locator fixed.
Dr. Park, I would then say I kindly defer to Dr. Resnick, right? I'll be that guy to say, make sure you come back next week. What I would say is high level to this is that it really is in what's the opposing arch, right? So if I have a patient wearing a locator fixed on the lower, it's opposing a complete denture on the upper, I'd probably want to go ahead and do lingualized occlusion and a bilateral balanced occlusion, that type of thing. If it's fixed over fixed, I would probably do something like a group function or potentially something of that nature. So mutually protected occlusion is key. I'm a huge Dawson follower. I love dots in the back, lines in the front, and making sure that we have a long centric and mutually protected occlusion.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Michael Scherer. I have to say, there's no better way to spend a Friday morning, and that is to have a great clinical lecture from a dedicated clinician, to have wonderful advice from our business advisory panel, and to have over 1,000 doctors tuning in who are dedicated to improving the care that they can render to their patients. So thanks to all of you who contributed to my great Friday morning. And I will look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Next week, we have our implant symposium, so we won't be here, but we'll be back in 2 weeks. And I look forward to seeing all of you then. Thank you so much. Michael, fantastic lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Park, for the opportunity. It's a pleasure.